Welcome to the Skol State of Mind podcast. As you already know, I'm your host, D Woods. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about free agency. I know free agency is right around the corner, so I thought it was only fitting that I break down how I feel about the Minnesota Vikings going into free agency. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down first the current players on the Minnesota Vikings that are slated to become free agents. And we're going to talk about if we should let them walk, bring them back, and we might even go into talking about certain players we might just outright cut and move on from. So let's get into it. So first off, the position group we're going to talk about is center. Now, the only free agent, currently for the Minnesota Vikings, is Austin Slotman. Now, this is how I feel about Austin Slotman. He's a serviceable backup, but the thing about center right now is there's a lot of ramblings that the Minnesota Vikings might move on from Garrett Bradbury. So they might just outright cut him and bring somebody else in. Now, if the Minnesota Vikings go in that direction, they might be bringing in two new centers on this team. I mean, if you think about Garrett Bradbury was actually, drafted in the first round, and he hasn't really panned out in the league to be that, elite type, center in this league. We see him get abused, in a lot of games because he's kind of undersized for a center. So if the Minnesota Vikings do decide to move on from Garrett Bradbury, that's going to be a big need we got to fill as a starting center. And I don't know if you will want to go look for another starting center in the draft. So, so that's just center. But back to Slotman, would I bring him back? Will let him walk? I still say we bring him back. Serviceable backup in this league. Why not? So let's talk about guard. Now, the current Minnesota Vikings that's slated to become free agents that are guards are Dalton Risner, Chris Reed, and Blake Brandel. Now, Chris Reed, Blake Brandel, I'll bring them back on maybe veteran deals or a little bit more because I feel like you need depth on this team, and depth is really important when you're building your roster. So I'm open to bringing them back because we don't necessarily feel like they're going to be starters on this team. So if you can have guys that know the system, that know the playbook, know where to be, know how to, help out the younger players, are good locker room guys, why not bring them back on a veteran deal or something a little bit more than a veteran deal to basically fill out your roster and have depth? So now let's talk about Dalton Risner. Dalton Risner was brought into the Minnesota Vikings mid-season after they basically, not after. Well, Ezra Cleveland got hurt, so they brought, Dalton Risner in, and, they decided to trade Ezra Cleveland to the Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, I get it, but we're not going to talk about that too much right now. So I'm not high on Dalton Risner at all. And the reason why I'm not high on Risner is I feel like he doesn't really contribute enough to the running game. Now, in the passing game, you can look at his PFF grades and, he didn't, allow any sacks, which is cool. But I feel like this: if we want to build an actual contender, to contend for a Super Bowl, or even if we want to be in the playoffs year to year, I feel like we need some nasty ass guards. And I think we need a guard that can basically do both on a consistent basis. And I feel like it's just too much hype on social media about Dalton Risner, and just watching them play, like I didn't really see too much difference between him and Ezra Cleveland. So that's somebody I would just move on from and let walk. So let's talk about the tackles. Now, we got three tackles that's basically slated to become free agents. We got Oli Udo, David Quisenberry, and Hakeem Adeniji. I hope I got that right. But I'm good on Adeniji. You can draft another, your third backup tackle. But as for Oli Udo, he's coming off an injury, from last year. I'm not sure what the injury was, a quad injury or something like that. I'm really not sure, but I know he had a leg injury that basically ended the season. I think Oli Udo is serviceable. He can play either the right tackle position or the left tackle position. And if we talk about tackles, like you really only signing tackles for depth or drafting for depth at this point because you have two of the best, tackles in the league. You got Darisaw on one side and you got O'Neal on the other. So I'm open to bringing Oli Udo back, barring his health, and maybe he can start, the season, actually playing, and he might even start on the pup lift. But David Quisenberry, I'm open to bringing him back too, because just like I said, we gotta build this roster out, and you need depth to move forward. All right. So we already talked about the linemen. So let's talk about the tight ends. I mean, the Vikings already brought back Johnny Munt and Nick Muse, but I feel like the Minnesota Vikings do need to do more in the tight end room because I don't know if TJ Hawkinson will be able to be healthy this season. He kind of took a whole month to get his surgery, and we still have to let him heal and then rehab. I don't know if he's going to be ready in time for the season. I mean, we looking like maybe like October, November. So his season might be lost. So we're going to talk about who the Minnesota Vikings should bring in later on to help out with the, pass catching. All right. So fullback is really nothing to see here because, you know, our fullback, is CJ Ham. We know he's coming back. So we can move on from there. So let's talk about running back. All right. Alexander Madison got cut. So he's not on the team anymore. And the running back that basically is becoming a free agent is Cam Akers. Now, Cam Akers, he was about to start rolling. I felt like he was, getting his feet under him. He was getting some rhythm, and then he tore his Achilles. Now, since we already cut Alexander Madison, and I, did videos about that, I'm not going to say too much on Madison. But for Cam Akers, should we bring him back? No. I think we're done. We're done with Cam Akers. I think the Minnesota Vikings should basically bring in a true star running back of a Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, maybe depending, on what the money looks like, and maybe even Derrick Henry. So I just feel like, yeah, sorry, Cam Akers, thank you for coming in, helping us out, but we got to move on from there. All right. So wide receiver. Now, for wide receiver, you got KJ Osborne is basically becoming a free agent, and you got Brandon Powell. Now, a lot of people believe that we should bring Brandon Powell back as the third receiver. I'm not high on that. I understand he can do more in special teams, so he has added value. But I don't. I rather bring KJ back. I either rather bring KJ back or draft, a third receiver, in maybe the fourth round, considering you got 2 fourth-round picks, or maybe sign one in free agency. But I don't even think that KJ Osborne is going to command the type of money that's going to scare the Minnesota Vikings away. So I'm open to bringing KJ Osborne back on a deal that's basically going to, not break the bank, because I don't think he is. But you never know, because free agency, it can be way, way too unpredictable. So now let's talk about it. I noticed the big subject, and this is kind of why I waited. Quarterback. Now, the pending free agents for the Minnesota Vikings at quarterback is Kirk Cousins and Josh Dobbs. Now, I'm going to make this short and quick. Thank you, Josh Dobbs. I appreciate the 2 wins, but we moving on. As for Kirk Cousins, I think it's time to move on from Kirk Cousins. I really do. I think the Minnesota Vikings should draft somebody in free agency, and not draft somebody for agency. I'm sorry. I think the Minnesota Vikings should draft somebody, in this upcoming draft, and that can be the quarterback of the future, and basically sign maybe a Sam Darnold, in free agency that can, solidify the position until the rookie quarterback is ready. Like I'm open to that. I just think it's time that the Minnesota Vikings move on for Kirk Cousins. Now, who do I want the Minnesota Vikings to bring in out of all these positions? Guard, you got your backup tackles, you got your wide receivers, you got your quarterback. Huh. I think the Minnesota Vikings, first off, like I said before, I feel like the Minnesota Vikings should bring in a starting caliber running back that can solidify the position and basically make that position group, blossom. As for left guard, I don't think the Minnesota Vikings should attack that in free agency. I think they need to actually draft left guard in this upcoming draft and basically develop them. I know people out there are going to be like, well, what we did that with Ed Ingram. If you look at how Ed Ingram actually played his first season, he got better at the latter part of the season. And I think he didn't make great strides, but he made improvement on his second year, and he's only in year 3. So that's how I feel about the guards. As for the tackles, just like I said before, you got 2 of the best tackles in the league. You basically just are going to sign players for depth to kind of make sure, you can have backups just in case anybody gets hurt. Center is a wild card for me right now because I'm not really familiar with all the centers that's basically coming in free agency. But I do think the Minnesota Vikings might pull the trigger on Garrett Bradbury. So you might have 2 new centers on this roster next year. But wide receiver, this is how I look at wide receiver. Just going back over it, we still don't know what we have in Jalen Naylor going forward. You can always sign, veteran receivers in free agency, and you can also draft guys. Considering that the Minnesota Vikings already have, Jordan Addison, who showed flashes of being a good receiver, and Justin Jefferson, who is the best receiver in this league. That's not really a need for the Minnesota Vikings to go out there and try to get a big time receiver to come on his team. You'll basically try to get a receiver that can come in and probably be your third receiver on this roster and be consistent. Just like I said before, we really don't know what we have in, Jalen Naylor because he hasn't really played consistency. And for quarterback, I mean, if you're going to get a stopgap quarterback in free agency, I like Sam Darnold. I mean, some people don't. I feel like Sam Darnold is serviceable. I feel like Sam Darnold will be able to come in and know his role. It's crazy because you got reports like talking about, Zach Wilson, Russell Wilson, Baker Mayfield, Jacoby Brissett. Like, out of all those guys, I really feel like if the Minnesota Vikings do move on from Kirk Cousins and Kirk Cousins does not come back, and the Minnesota Vikings decide to draft somebody in free agency to be the quarterback of the future, I'm open. Like, go get Sam Darnold. I like Sam Darnold coming out of SC. So, I mean, that could be, swaying my opinion on Darnold. But I think he can come in here and help this team out. So, thank you guys for tuning in to the Skol State of Mind podcast. I am going to work on the defensive video a little bit later and drop that for y'all. I just wanted to get this in before free agency hits. So, Skol, baby.